without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our first speaker, which is Jessica Jones. Jessica Jones finished her MA in Art History this year, and she hopes to be a gallery curator. And today she is presenting an analysis of the social construction of sex and gender and how Western cultures participate in a binary model that is in fact non-existent.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Jess, let's get this started. And yeah, I'm talking about sex and gender, the sex that's on your passport, not the other kind. And yeah, we are looking at the binary model, looking beyond the binary model. So to any sex and gender diverse people here, feel free to call me out if I say anything messed up, which I'm likely to do. Either stick your hand up and say something during, or come and see me afterwards, much appreciated. But first off, just a common differentiation that is made in all initial discussions about sex and gender. They're generally separated out by saying that sex has something to do with the body, sort of differing characteristics within physical bodies of people, such as genitalia, presence of breast tissue, and many other forms of differences. Whereas gender has to do more with the mind and identities and roles in society, such as you may identify as a man and prefer to be called he by others, and perhaps subscribe to masculinity. The majority view in Western society on sex and gender is that difference between the two isn't really recognised. They're pretty much used interchangeably as one and the same, and there's only two options. So in sex you're either male and female, or female, and in genders there's pretty much only two categories recognised, a man or a woman, and male pretty much equals man, female pretty much equals woman. That's how it's generally thought of. And both are assigned at birth solely on the basis of the appearance of a baby's external genitalia. So that's the decider for both things. And the two categories are also oppositional. So they're defined in opposition to one another. You often hear about the opposite sex, and we hear a lot about the extreme differences between men and women. So this situates the two recognised types of bodies and identities as discrete categories with no crossover, entirely separate from one another and vastly different. If we look at just sex now, we look at the binary model of sex in Western society. If you're classed as female, you're expected to have all of the things in that category there. So XX chromosomes, ovaries, estrogens and progestrogens as your dominant sex hormones, vagina, vulva, clitoris and breasts and other secondary sex characteristics after puberty, and all of the others in the other category if you are assigned male. Again, you might notice that there's two options in every category. We really like the binary model in the West. It's quite simple and black and white. So there's two options here. You're either XX or you're XY. Then each leads to the other. They're assumed to always be in alignment, and it's situated as the objective determining factors of a person's sex, which will stay constant throughout an individual's life. And yet only one of those factors is taken into account when assigning someone's sex, and that is the primary sex characteristics, the external genitalia and the appearance of them at birth. So it's understood as static over a person's lifetime, despite only one of these being unalterable and irremovable. That's the chromosomes. Otherwise, ovaries and testes can be removed. Your dominant sex hormones can be adjusted with hormone therapy. If you've got the resources and the money and the access to medical treatment, you can get sex reassignment surgery on genitalia. And taking hormones can also alter secondary sex characteristics as well. So that's the binary range that the West assumes at birth, but also at birth there are all of these options in reality that we don't really hear about in biology class. So sex chromosomes are not just XX and XY, they're also all of these other options which are possible and have existed. Some are more common than others, some are very rare, mosaics are quite rare. XXY and XYY are about 1 in every 2,000 births. The gonads are pretty dual, either ovaries or testes, but the other option is ovotestes, which is a combination of ovarian tissue and testicular tissue together. All types of sex hormones are present in everybody who has a working gonad. So in cis men, there is still some level of estrogen and progestogens. So across all sexes, the levels of each hormones vary widely, and also individuals' receptivity to hormones as well. So as an example, if we go back, there's an example called androgen insensitivity, which is when someone is born with XY sex chromosomes, testes. Androgens is the dominant sex hormones, but because they're not receptive to androgens, because they're insensitive to androgens, they are born with a vulva and are generally assigned female at birth because that's the only one that we take into account, and raised female, raised as a girl and everything. So that's one of the sort of exceptions to our normal narrative. Again, the primary sex characteristics can also vary widely. The size of the clitoris or penis can vary. Genital configurations may combine aspects of the two typical structures in many different ways as well. So it's not just two discrete categories, it's more like a big bell curve. The secondary sex characteristics after puberty also all vary widely, and none are entirely limited to a single sex category. So cis men can also have breasts, cis women can also have facial hair, and pretty much everything else you can think of can also cross over all the gender and sex categories. So, the sex binary is a little bit false, doesn't really reflect reality. So, there's a study here by Black, Les, and everybody else. In the top graph is the normal view in the medical institutions of the West and in the mainstream, where you've got men and women completely separate and all the attributes sort of vary on bell curves within them with no crossover. In reality, there is some crossover. About 1 to 2 births in every 100 have some sort of crossover of those normal categories, and those individuals are usually turned intersex. So intersex people are about as common as redheads. But that strict binary model of sex and gender harms them because, especially the ones who are born with some sort of combination of the external genitalia configurations, as they are often operated on as babies or children in order to force their bodies to fit the binary model. So it's not just theoretical, it does actually have practical implications. And moving on to gender, again, binary. So, woman or man, feminine or masculine. She or he. So there's strong gender roles from birth, depending on that sex assignment, setting out the ideal versions of masculinity and femininity and how you are supposed to relate in society depending on your gender. And these modes of gender expression are again defined by their opposition to one another. So feminine things are generally the opposite to masculine things, and so on. And gender is also assumed to be static across an individual's lifetime. If you're assigned female at birth, you're expected to be raised as a girl, you will be raised as a girl, and expected to stay a woman your whole life. But the actual range of gender in reality is not that simple. There are many, many, many different genders. This is just a few that I'm familiar with in New Zealand. Infinite possibilities and combinations. It's a rainbow, not grayscale. And they can vary across an individual's lifetime. So you may identify as one thing early on and then change your sort of identity later, and it can sort of evolve and all sorts of different things. And it's not just he or she. There are other pronouns to use for non-binary folks like they and them, and you're welcome to to Google gender-neutral pronouns to find more. So that's just within New Zealand, a few of the terms that I know. There are a huge range of different genders across the world. So there's this map that you can go to on the internet and look at all the different cultures around the world. Well, this is not all of them, but a small selection of the genders around the world who recognise more than 2 sexes and genders, which is most of them. I'm fairly sure that Western culture is the only one that limits sex and gender to 2 categories and links them so firmly without any flexibility or fluidity. So, yeah, that's an interesting thing to go and look up, although the language used in it is really problematic and biased, but still, interesting. This is another sort of cool thing to try and make a sort of diagram about sex, gender, as well as gender expression and attraction but it's based in a sort of Western model, so you've got womanness and manness, again, those two categories on every option. But it's cool to look up and maybe explore it if you're interested. Gives you more of an idea of different ways of being. But just to complicate things even further, I said at the start that sex and gender are quite separate, right? So sex was to do with physical things, with bodies, and gender was more to do with more amorphous things, like it's to do with your identity and your mind and how we relate to each other in society. But in actual fact, sex and gender are not really separate concepts, because those physical things that we term sex are only the physical things that society genders. Okay, so there's lots and lots of differing aspects of bodies that are not gendered. Hair and eye colour are not gendered. We don't give birth to a blue-eyed baby and go, oh, it's a girl. That doesn't happen. It's always based on genitalia. It doesn't need to be. It just happens to be so. There are differing aspects of bodies, such as skin colour, that we think about in different ways. We make a construct of race based on those differences. Just so happens that the differences to do with sexuality and procreation are gendered. So although these physical differences are real, they are very objectively real, sex is nevertheless a social construct that is inextricably linked to the equally subjective construct of gender. And so we don't actually, it could be that we didn't have gender, but we do, so here we are. Lastly, I got this thing because I like it. It's kind of making fun of the gingerbread man earlier. If this was me drawing a gender spectrum, that would be how it looks like, because it's just so complex. But two of the main things that this deals with here is, what does transgender mean? One of the common sort of questions. So that means that you do not identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth. You are not the gender that was assigned to you. So you could be anything else, but not that one. Cisgender means that you are the gender that was assigned to you at birth. Lucky you. Things are very nice and easy and simple in many different ways, if that is the case. And it's just saying, don't ask or assume stuff about anyone's genitalia, and ask for pronouns if you're unsure how someone identifies. It's considered pretty polite and okay and appropriate to just say, hey, what pronouns do you prefer? And if they say he or she, then respect that. And if they say they or ze or anything weird, then you have to use those too. And even then, this is still a simplification, because trans and cis is really, really helpful for most people. But if you're intersex, it's kind of mucked up again there. But still, we'll leave it there. And I will happily take some questions if anyone has any. Anything at all? Yes?
Do you think that the tendency of people in Western society is to be really bothered if they don't know somebody's sex, but not be so bothered if they don't know their race or age? Do you think that comes from having two gender pronouns and they're kind of mutually exclusive?
Absolutely. It's built into our language. Like, we can't even really refer to someone unless we know their sex. And when people don't know someone's gender and they refer to them as it, they literally dehumanize someone if they do not know their gender. So it is so important in our whole makeup to know someone's gender, which is very specific to English. Like, I learn Māori, and the third person pronoun is ia, that's it. It's not gendered. Everyone is ia. So you can talk about somebody for a long, long time, and the other person might never know their gender, and it's not a problem. But for us, that we can use they. I use they a lot, so I'll talk about my friend, and they went to the shop, blah, blah, blah. And you won't know their gender, but it will bother you. And it takes ages to try and deconstruct that and to try and train yourself to not worry so much about gender. It's the same when you see someone and you don't know what gender they are. You might stare and try and figure out clues, because we always fit people into those two categories. And everything else as well, I mean, from behaviours and clothing and toys and all sorts of different things are gendered in our lives all the way through. So it's very ingrained, yeah. Yeah?
Do you think that, which you're kind of touching on at the end, Do you think that the use of cis and trans is problematic in the sense that wouldn't everybody really be trans? Like, it seems like cis is artificial in the sense that, I mean, is anyone really what you're assigned? That seems to be boxing that in, that you must be what you've been assigned.
Yeah, it is a simplification. It's definitely a simplification. But it works for this society in which the majority of people never question their sex or gender. And they gain a lot of privileges from that that they may never think about. For instance, those people who have never questioned which toilet they walk into in public. Those people who have travelled and never worried about the sex on their passport. There's so many things, and those people, we need a word for them, and they are cisgender. They are the ones who live according to all their documentation and what they were assigned at birth. So it definitely helps to have that word, but it is a simplification and it may not be needed in future. Anything else? No? Cool. Thank you. Oh, yes, yeah.
I've got a question about concepts that kind of work almost all the time and then occasionally fall over. Mm-hmm. So you've got this word bird, and basically it refers to things that have wings and can fly, except it doesn't because there are penguins. Mm. And maybe the reason it's taken 500 or more years for the things to look at to become issues that are even questioned is because the language actually does do communicative work most of the time. Mm. And people fall through the gaps of that. That doesn't mean it's functionless or deliberately broken. Mm. It's a blind spot.
Yeah, that could be so. I think the thing is that it's not just a recent thing that people are being harmed by these words. It's a whole societal structure that has constantly harmed over hundreds of years those people who do not fit into sex and gender binaries. So, I mean, the average age for a trans person is 24. Intersex people are operated on at birth and non-consensual medically unnecessary surgeries. This isn't just a language problem. This is a societal problem of how we conceptualise sex and gender. And the language does reflect that in that it marginalises and just makes invisible anybody else who doesn't fit into that. Yeah.
Do you think that the use of transgender and cis marginalises people who have thought about their gender, have decided that they are cis, but are still aware of those other people who don't and are understanding that as well?
No, there's nothing wrong with being cis. Absolutely nothing at all.
It seems like, you know, it's saying, oh yes, you've got a lot of privilege and blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
But it feels maybe unnatural to just say everyone who's not trans is this sort of person who identifies very strongly with whatever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, I get what you mean. There's nothing wrong with having privilege though. There's nothing bad about it. And if you are aware of it and you make room for those who don't have it, then that's all you got to do. That's perfect. That's fine. Like if you're cis and you don't question anybody's right to be in the toilet, great. Or if you're cis and you never question somebody else's gender identity, fabulous. That's all you got to do. There's nothing wrong with being cis and having privilege. So yeah, it's not a negative thing at all. Yeah. Yes.
So you talk about how like the sort of the existence of the binary kind of thing differs across cultures. Like, is there any good ideas about why it should should turn out this way in say Western culture, or like what's the origin of that?
That's very interesting. I really wouldn't be able to answer that in a simple question. I think it goes back through, I don't know, that sort of the whole science and medical structure, I think classifying people into rigid boxes rather than in other cultures, there is in many ways a fluidity. You know, like, I don't know if many other cultures have such an attachment to labels and classifying and pathologizing anything that isn't typical. You know, like in other cultures you might get something that's very rare but perfectly fine. Whereas in Western culture we give that a syndrome name and we try and fix it to make you like everybody else. So I don't know I think you could probably trace that back, but it would go back hundreds if not thousands of years. I think the ancient Greeks had no problem with people who didn't fit into the binary. But.
Alright,
Okay. If we have more time at the end, maybe.
Yeah, we have time at the end. Thank you, we're back. Okay, thank you to Jessica for a really awesome talk. Still speaking, huh? Our next speaker is Will Matthews. He's studying for his BA in politics and history, and he intends to pursue postgraduate study. He's particularly interested in New Zealand politics, and he's the only guy on the panel, so he's like our equivalent of affirmative action. And I can say that because Will is my friend, my co-moderator, and one of the most decent people I know. He's also part of Princes Street Labour. His talk today is about the presence of patriarchy in our political systems, in our New Zealand political system and internationally, with regard to representation of women in the political sphere. Thank you, Will.
Hey, hi guys. It's really good to be here. So yeah, I'm Will, and I'm male and a feminist. And I'm also a politics student, and my big interest in politics revolves around New Zealand politics, so kind of feminism and politics colliding in any regard is really good for me. I am a member of the Labour Party, but I've tried to keep this presentation as unbiased as possible, and I think I actually end up being really mean about Labour. So you'll see that. It's not a particularly scientific presentation, but I hope it's reasonable. It's based on kind of my kind of experiences of different trends relating to gender in the New Zealand political system. And so it's kind of all my thoughts. I'm totally happy to hear people's thoughts and criticisms of it afterwards. So yeah, there are many aspects of gender politics in New Zealand that we can be proud of. In 1893, we became the first nation in which women claimed the right to vote. So that was with Kate Shepherd, you can see there. And this petition was collected by the women's suffrage movement. Thousands of women signed it. And it's an incredibly impressive movement in 1893. The woman in the middle is Elizabeth McCombs, who was the first New Zealand woman elected to Parliament. She wasn't the first in the world, but her achievement definitely opened up representation in Parliament to women. But this is a really good thing, but we can't just look to the past and assume that New Zealand is doing everything right. There is definitely a need to examine the role of women in politics more closely, because I think that the fight for equality and progression for women in New Zealand is just as unfinished in Parliament as it is in our wider society. So we'll start off with some statistics. Our Parliament is currently made up of is only 34% women. It was 32% when after the 2011 elections, but all of the 3 new MPs that have come in have been women, so that went up a bit. That is up, I think, about 6% since 2002, but I mean, 34% is certainly not good enough for a country that claims to be as socially progressive as New Zealand. This puts us at about 25th on the world scale of gender representation in parliaments. If anyone's interested, Rwanda is first, with over 54%, because they introduced compulsory quotas, which are very similar to what Labour proposed earlier this year, but I'll get to that later. So this is the Labour Party list in the last election. All the candidates in red are women, and all the ones with stars are the ones that actually got elected. So you'll see that 28 of those candidates were women, which is under half, obviously, and only about 11 of them actually ended up getting elected. And so this is Labour, who claims to be the party of social progression in New Zealand. And this definitely demonstrates a lack of representation even amongst parties that claim to have that. These are the stats for the other party lists of parties that got into Parliament. As you can see, it's all vastly under 50%, or vastly underrepresented. the Green Party gets special mention because although there was only about a third woman in their list, their front bench team was 8 women. So out of the 14 that have been elected, they are over half, which is good. But you know, kind of, there's still only a third women in their list. I think shout out to United Future, who claimed to be the party of like family and sensible centrism, but only had 2 women in their list. So this just really goes to show that there is definitely a lack of representation in New Zealand. I'd go as far to say that we're definitely not close at all to equal representation. So you have to ask the question, why is it that women are not being selected or being put in the lower halves of the party lists? One argument is of merit. There's a big lot of people that kind of stand for meritocracy. So to jump across the ditch, we had Tony Abbott, who claimed that the reason his cabinet only had 1 woman in it was because of merit. Just simply, all the women in his party just didn't make it, and all the men were better than them. No sexism about it. But note that Tony Abbott made himself Minister for Women's Affairs as well. Just leave that hanging. So I think that meritocracy doesn't exist. And there's a number of reasons for that, and it's not just because I'm going out and saying that everyone is sexist and the whole political system is sexist. Richard Arneson, who is a professor in America, I think, said that debates about the seemingly banal norm of equality of opportunity reveal profound disagreements as to the nature of fair terms of cooperation in the modern world. And what I think that is saying is that there can be no meritocracy because merit is entirely subjective. And so when we look at merit, that is shaped by each person who is deciding what merit is. So I will have a different opinion of what makes merit than everyone else in this room. And seeing as the political system, dating right back to the kind of English Civil War, Westminster system really evolving, was created by old white men. That is Oliver Cromwell. And then in New Zealand was really shaped by old white men. It's Richard Seddon, who was one of the earliest prime ministers in New Zealand. And it was geared towards things that men are traditionally associated with. So that's kind of fiery rhetoric and like testosterone-fueled confrontations. And that's a lot of what we've seen in Parliament. That's how Parliament enacts its day-to-day business. And then in New Zealand, it was kind of the people that are famous in our political system are people that meet those expectations. So Robert Muldoon, who was Prime Minister in the 70s and 80s, and who was famous for his kind of confrontational style. People were scared of him. And then when we got the MMP system, the guy who was Prime Minister at the time, Jim Bolger, is an old white man. So we see this obvious lean towards maledom in the political system. So that's why I think, at least in politics, that meritocracy doesn't exist, because deciding who becomes a candidate is entirely based on the subjective opinions of those who are doing the choosing, and as we have seen, those people are usually old white men. But I think because they are old white men, that means that patriarchy does exist in our political system. So what is patriarchy? It's a social system in which males are the primary authority figures, blah, 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 implies the institutions of male rule and privilege and entails female subordination. And I want to highlight that bit, and that was really important for the rest of my presentation. And it becomes obvious when you look at the women who up until now have been major players in our political system. So we've got Jenny Shipley, who was the first woman Prime Minister of New Zealand, Helen Clark, who was the first elected female Prime Minister, Judith Collins, who is a national minister, Jeanette Fitzsimmons, who was co-leader of the Green Party, Tariana Turia, co-leader of the Maori Party, and Annette King, who was a very prominent Labour Party minister. So something that you notice about all of these women is that the way they present themselves, their image, they take on kind of features that you would associate with masculinity, so the short hair, and all of these women at some point have been called like butch or whatever at various points in their careers. And I want to take Helen Clark as a really good example of this, because Helen Clark, when she came into politics, obviously people didn't associate her with femininity. So she became leader of the opposition. I don't actually have a photo of this. I was looking for hours today. In the 1996 general election, she turned up for this leaders' debate with this crazy kind of spiky hairstyle. It was absolutely insane, and it didn't work at all. But it was because there'd been a lot of pressure on her to become more feminine. People were challenging the fact that she looked like a man, and people saying she was masculine. And ironically, this is where the ironies come in, that didn't work for her at all. So because people were saying she'd become too feminine. So she went back to what she obviously felt more comfortable with, which is just her traditional look, which is associated with masculinity. And they told her that she was too masculine again. And so in the kind of elections when she was Prime Minister, she had this really photoshopped image that was at the start of the presentation, this one. And then people started ripping into her for trying to kind of glam herself up and becoming too feminine again. So it's so ironic, I think, that that she was made to do that. And I think that is a huge example of patriarchy in our political system. Because men, or that kind of undertone in society, can't cope with a woman who is breaking out of the kind of domestic, private sphere that they have been confined to for so long. And they reverse the power relationship in politics and in society. So this patriarchy seeks to dominate women and label them in derogatory ways to get back on top. And I'm going to touch on a couple... First, quickly, all the women in New Zealand traditionally get portfolios that are not associated with kind of like hard work and power. So we've had very few female finance ministers, very few female justice ministers. They usually get health or social development and things that are more associated with that area of politics. Judith Collins breaks that model a bit. She's justice minister. But as we all know, Judith Collins is referred to as Crusher Collins. Is her nickname, something scary and robot-like. And that segues really well into an international example of Margaret Thatcher, who got no credibility at all as an MP or as leader of the Conservative Party because she was seen as too feminine. So she had to take on this really kind of scary, hard persona that saw her labelled as the Iron Lady, which I think is really similar to Judith Collins being called a robot. And tough and scary male prime ministers don't get that. Robert Muldoon never got that. And it's because, like I said before, men are seeking to kind of dominate and label strong women because they can't deal with the fact that this power relationship has been reversed. So this has examples all around the world. Prime Minister Julia Gillard recently, in the election, the Conservative Party had this menu at one of their dinners where they made this jibe at Julia Gillard as a quail, saying she had small breasts, huge thighs, and a big red box. And this was Tony Abbott, who we saw before, said that he was choosing his cabinet based on meritocracy. Again, America, the Republican Party, not very original, did the same thing for Hillary Clinton at a convention recently in Kentucky, I think. And our very own Phil Goff said this a few months ago when he was addressing Chris Finlayson in Parliament, made special mention of the fact that Chris Finlayson had somehow been undermined because he'd been beaten 3 times by a female member of Parliament in the general elections, and that is Annette King in Rongotai. So we have this patriarchy kind of seeking to dominate women like this. But recently we've seen younger women coming through into the political sphere, like Jacinda Ardern and Nikki Kay, who are very good examples of the younger generation of female politicians, but certainly not the only ones. And they both contested the Auckland Central electorate in 2011. But the focus of the media on society wasn't on the political kind of aspirations or incredible talents of these women. It was Battle of the Babes, because they're both young, attractive women. And it completely made light of Denise Roche, who was the Green candidate in this. But they called her the auntie of this election. And she's not particularly old-looking or kind of masculine-looking or whatever, but just because she wasn't young and attractive and maybe not as feminine as these two, she was slung back into that area with the older politicians. So I think this shows that patriarchy definitely continues to dominate in the New Zealand political system, and it was done in this case through sexism and ageism, turned these candidates into objects of gratification. The kind of babes as a term also implies this kind of like bimbo thing, which you see everywhere, and definitely does not reflect on the very valid and intelligent political thoughts of these women, and definitely not Denise Roche. So what can we do about it? Very publicised attempt by the Labour Party earlier this year to introduce women's quotas, which was when they would, in some electorates, only choose female candidates to contest the list, or to contest the candidacy for that election and things. And it was absolutely panned in the media. And that didn't help by the fact that Labour politicians actually came out and against it. And you'll notice here, again, that these are all old white men. And Phil Goff's back again, and Damien O'Connor, who's in the bottom left there, were caught in controversy in the 2011 elections by saying that the list selection was being run by a gaggle of gays. So that's the kind of person that is not in favour of women's quotas like this. And then David Shearer, ill-fated David Shearer, actually forced New Zealand Council to drop the quota, which was never a policy. It was just being debated in the on the floor of the Labour conference, so it will never get to Labour conference. So that's obviously a problem in that we can't even begin to exact change because there is that inherent patriarchy still shown through those old white men in the party itself. So one thing that I would put forward is that we can do this through other party legislation, which would involve, obviously, parties legislating, forcing themselves to have equality. One of a really good example of this is the zipline system of the Green Party, when they kind of rank candidates but have to stop every few places to consider race, gender, sexual preferences or whatever, which is a really, really good system, and the Greens are required to do it. And we've obviously seen it work to an extent because 8 of their front bench were women. So the problem, obviously outside influence, one of the reasons the man ban was such a fiasco, one of the reasons David Shearer dropped it in the first place was that it got labelled a man ban, and there was no support from outside the party. So it shows there's obviously still this complete abhorrence of women being able to gain any kind of representation in this male-dominated society. And oppositions within the parties, these guys, like I said before, Nikki Kay herself talks about equality of opportunity in the National Party all the time. If you look in Kate magazine, which was released today around the uni, there's an interview with her in which she actually does talk about the National Party as a meritocracy. Yeah, so I really think that I was personally very sceptical of the man ban women's quotas when it first came out as a member of the Labour Party. I thought that parties should just be able to do this anyway. It's kind of, come on guys, this is 2013. But I think that because we've obviously been shown through all of these statistics, all of the reactions we've seen, and just the continuing day-to-day oppression of women in all aspects of the public sphere, that the only thing we can do really is that as the parties in New Zealand do enact legislation to create equality, and I think that's really sad that in this day and age we are not able to just do that anyway. But women are underrepresented, and that is just a fact that we have to deal with. And I read something brilliant in Kate magazine, which was written by my friend Tessa Morgan, in her article about the public sphere. She uses a quote from President Lyndon Johnson about slavery and civil rights that says, "You can't take a person who for years has been hobbled by chains and liberate him, then bring him up to the starting line of a race and then say you are free to compete with all the others and still believe that you have been completely fair." Tessa goes on to say that similarly, the mere opening up of the public sphere to women is not enough to achieve actual equality. And I think this sums up what I want to say really nicely. We have opened up the public sphere so women have the opportunity to participate, but we can't just stick them there by themselves and say, you can do this, because the sad fact is that so much pressure and the way society and the political system is run, that means that that can't happen. So that's why I think that parties need to legislate to bring that representation in, because it's not going to happen any other way. So my conclusions: we have a rich history of representation, that's great, but there's still more to be done. There is evidence of patriarchy all across the political system and outside of New Zealand, and we see that through day-to-day events and statistics and all the things that I showed before. We have many strong female politicians, but we have to question how their gender has actually impacted their actions, images, and careers. Meritocracy is a flawed ideal based on just the subjectivity of the people who are kind of in power to choose candidates and things. And by legislating equally, parties are taking a step in the right direction. And I'm going to do some shameless flogging of mine and my friend's blog here. This actually appeared on the blog, so if you are interested in anything more we have to say, do check it out. It's called The Left Estate. So that's me finished. I'm happy to take any questions now, if anyone has some, if we have time.
So you quoted Richarlison saying that there is massive disagreement on fair equality of opportunity and what fair competition means. And you are then going on to advocate a very specific vision of equality of opportunity. You said that the people doing the choosing of these women or candidates are persistently biased. Well, some of those people are the electorate. So while sympathetic to some of the things you said, I think you massively overstate your case. Richard Muldoon, for example, was vilified as Piggy Muldoon, and a part of why that it's not so salient now is because it happened 30 plus years ago. There were jokes about him having mistresses, or one mistress in particular, I forget in which suburb. There was a magazine headline, what was it? Rooting pig shot in Ruakau, PM safe. That's where his mistress was reported to live. Now that's a negative stereotype about male politicians. We've got an example of that in the media, that there's some truth to that, but the way it's handled is questionable.
Hey, my point about Robert Muldoon was more just about how he is still remembered as a kind of very dominant, very imposing force in Parliament. And I think that you certainly are right when you say that it's not necessarily. Oh, so what could you say the first half of that again?
My main point was so the voters had a say in this.
Yeah.
And Helen Clark got elected, and Maggie Thatcher was appointed leader of the Conservative Party. And granted, it might be difficult. Politics is presumably difficult for anyone. Presumably, it is more difficult for female candidates. But the electors get a say in this, and they can vote at the moment for the Green Party, which has a zipline policy, and they can vote for other parties which don't, and they can join party organisations and as you're clearly involved in this, and that's positive. It's encouraging to see that you have a view on this and you're advocating it. It seems a bit extreme, though, to say that, given the Anderson point, that this particular vision of how to achieve equality of opportunity should be legislated for.
Yeah. So I think the fact that we are able to have people and voters involved in creating our lists and things is really good. And especially the Labour Party and the Green Party both involve people from the community in choosing them. And that is part of my conclusion about legislating for equality. So I don't mean that this is something that hasn't happened already, because it is present in some aspects of our party system. But I do think that there is certainly more that can be done. But you're right, there are definitely aspects of kind of people choosing our candidates that are not kind of those old white men I was talking about in power. But I do still think that the general kind of just the people who are heard most in society and the people that do in general have more of an influence on the way our party system is carried out and how candidates are chosen. There is still a long way to go to make that completely equal, and we do need to do more within the parties themselves to bring that about. But it's certainly not something that is only just going to start. It is happening still with things like Labour's new democratic constitutional process and the Green Party's ranking system. Hope that answers your question.
Got to be quick about that. Thank you, Will. Okay, our third speaker is Judy Ting-Edwards. She is a graduate of Auckland University with a BA LLB, and she is a family lawyer out west. Good luck. She worked in Melbourne as a specialist in the domestic violence court, and her talk today is about domestic violence and the role men have in it and her own experiences. So, thank you, Judy.
I won't take too long because I know everyone's hungry, especially me. So I promise not to take too long. But I just want to say that this talk is solely about my experience working at a specialist domestic violence court in Melbourne. It's, and my reflections about domestic violence and the role of men. What this talk is not about is definitely the academic research about domestic violence and this kind of things, because I'm not an academic, as you know. I work out there on the front line with perpetrators and victims of domestic violence as a family lawyer. That's what I wanted to do after I graduated from my BA LLB. And bear in mind that this talk is not about any legal advice or domestic violence law, so please don't put your hand up and go, I had a domestic last night, what do I do? So if you want to, I can give you my principal lawyer's business card, and we can talk that in private later on. So just a little bit about me. My education, as you know, is I've got a BA double major in politics and philosophy here at the University of Auckland, and I've also got a law degree. And I did a lot of political philosophy papers. Some of you are my classmates from way back. I admit I am a bit rusty with feminist theory, but I try and to be a good feminist all throughout my career and my university education. But what shocked me was going into Melbourne, working in the domestic violence court. It changed my view of feminist theory And I thought it might be good to share with you my experience because, you know, you say you want to be equal and you want to treat people with equality, but sometimes it doesn't work that way in reality, and this is my experience. So a little bit about the Melbourne Magistrates Court. See, I have visual things. So this is the Heidelberg Magistrates Court. I was pretty much a fly on the wall at the Heidelberg Magistrates Court for a whole year, and that's where I lived. Not really, but during the day, I guess. And I've seen almost every twist and turn of the domestic violence order. So, you know, I've almost seen every sort of situation, whether it be lesbian, gay violence or transgender violence, you know, cultural, immigrant violence, refugee violence, you name it, I've seen it. But while I was there, just a little bit about the court. So in Melbourne, it's one of the world-class domestic violence courts. We don't have that in New Zealand, and I'm hoping that we will. The particular thing about Melbourne is that they have a victim and, well, they have applicants and respondent workers. So applicant workers are social workers who work with the applicant. So obviously applicants are seen as victims of domestic violence, and respondents are perpetrators, so they have workers to help them through their issues. These workers have social connections where they can refer you on to refuge, women's refuge, or they can refer you on to anger management courses and things like that. And they are extremely valuable when you are in a high pressure environment, especially working as a duty lawyer. You can only see the client for 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and you've got to take your instructions and you've got to represent them in court. So, you know, while the clients are waiting, these support persons are just priceless. There are separate areas in these courts. So there's the protected persons area and a respondent area. So the respondent area, the respondents usually sit with the rest of the public. For some reason, I don't know why we shouldn't have a separate area for respondents and let them out large with the public. Yeah. But these separate areas are strange because you would have one case 1 week where, you know, it's husband hitting the wife, and the wife is sitting at the protected persons area, but then the next week the husband's sitting in the protected persons area and you're kind of going, okay, hi, you know, and the wife is sitting in the dangerous person area, or, you know, the respondent area. So, you know, in some cases there are very, very clear victims. You know, I'm talking about like the stereotypical what's published in the media, you know, man beats wife, wife goes into hospital, eventually, you know, has a debilitating injury or becomes disabled, that kind of stuff. But there are, you know, but most of the time, this is what surprised me, because I was expecting to see these cases of, you know, man hit wife, or man hit woman, man assault female kind of thing, male assault female kind of thing. But what surprised me with my experience was that a lot of the time the dichotomy between victim and perpetrators are blurred. I think I like to use the term flooders and stonewallers. It depends, in different situations, in different conflict situations, people, especially in intimate relationships, people do talk about, especially marriage counsellors, do talk about flooders and stonewallers. So flooders are someone who, when they encounter a conflict, they feel so angry that they want to let it all out. They just speak their mind, you know, they literally give you a piece of their mind, you know. So they just, you know, tell you, I think you're a piece of blah, you know. And there are stonewallers, and often flooders and stonewallers will be in the same situation. And sometimes, you know, stonewallers, as the term sounds, you just kind of stonewall, you shouldn't be quiet, you're kind of fuming inside, but you don't say anything. Stonewallers are typically associated with males, and flooders are typically associated with females, but that's not necessarily the case all the time. A lot of time, sometimes both people who are flooders, one will become a stonewaller. So when they're just having a shouting match, one person will kind of just retreat and just kind of try to walk away from the situation. But then, you know, with these blurred cases, the reason why they're blurred is because the flooder will follow the stonewaller. And actually, have you heard about the anger bucket? I don't know how much thing, yeah. So, you know, once the stonewaller hits that threshold where they just can't take it anymore, that's when the physical violence starts emerging, or the kind of domestic violence that are seen. Well, domestic violence is defined as physical violence, emotional abuse, economic abuse. I can actually have a power wheel here. This is what we used at the court, which you've probably already seen before. So these are different types of violence. Physical violence is just at the surface, it's just on the outside. But on the inside, there's all these different kinds of violence that they talk about. So, regardless of what kind of violence they use, stonewallers tend to use violence once they reach their threshold. And this is when the police starts intervening and when we see the court orders coming out. I'm not saying that the stonewallers are at fault for committing the violence. I'm not saying that they're angels either. I think you know, you shouldn't really burst out into physical violence or any kind of violence, but it's a lot of time I find that the flooders had their own fault as well, and I've had lots of cases where the flooders would actually say, I should never have said that. I should never have said that, you know. And it's really quite sad because once the order's in, you can't get it out. So, you know, could you imagine having an order against someone that you love, which means that you guys can't be, there's literally an order, a piece of paper between you and that person. And, you know, that gets very sad. And another finding that I found was, so the very serious cases are usually the most unusual. So, you know, the ones where there's debilitating disability, there's debilitating injuries after the event. So I had, you know, I found that some of my lesbian couples, you know, they were the most violent. I don't know why, but I have a theory, but they were, you know, hospitalized for beating each other up. You know, the gay violence, the gay couples seem to be more in terms of the ones that I've seen at least, emotional sort of abuse, like cheating on the other person, etc. And male victims are usually really serious as well. So you know, we would have big Croatian woman beating the F out of his her partner, and you know the man would be who had a broken finger and things like that would come in, and they'd say, you know, all I did was that, and you know, she broke my finger, but that's okay, it's okay, you know, she's my wife, and you know, it's all right, you know. Or sometimes the male victims actually make a joke and they go, oh, it's just, she's just fooling around, it's okay, you know. I think they feel ashamed to be a victim, which I found it surprising because, you know, going back to my view of what the stereotype is, I didn't think that, because I thought because of the male privilege, these men would be stepping out and having a chat already, you know, calling the police already. My theory is that perhaps there's not enough reporting. People are ashamed to report as a male victim, or a gay and lesbian couple, or to say that they're in a gay and lesbian relationship. So that's why we get, you know, only the worst cases in court. So maybe there are, so, you know, we've only seen the tip of the iceberg. Maybe there's all these different, you know, violent relationships that we don't know about. There's also that cultural thing that I talked about. So, you know, this is where maybe one partner sponsors in the other partner into Australia or New Zealand in this case, and you know, the partner has limited English. So it's usually the worst cases where the police actually feels like they have to do something that we see them in court. So usually they're just kind of hush-hush. And just before I left, there was a funding cut for perpetrator support persons, or you know, respondent support persons. My good friend Frank lost his job, and I think it's just so sad because I felt that the respondent workers were doing more work to prevent domestic violence than the applicant workers. I definitely think that these men who are support workers of sometimes women, there was a woman, Helen, who worked there as a support person, they do more for the society than sort of the applicant workers who provide, you know, the support. Mind you, there are about 5 organisations that provide applicant support, and only about 1 organisation that provide respondent support, which was really sad. You've probably seen this, so I've probably talked about my reflections already, but I think the way to solve this problem is to definitely empower the applicants and not victimize them. So, you know, we've got this victim-perpetrator dichotomy, which I think, you know, seeps into our court system, which I don't know how helpful that is. I noticed Jessica talking about the, you know, the dichotomy. I don't know why we like using the dichotomy the way we do. I think if you empower the people, they can take charge of their lives, and they can actually seek help when they need to. I had, you know, one woman who didn't feel like she felt helpless, and then, you know, once she knew that there were avenues that she could use the domestic violence order to kick the drunken husband out of the house or something, then she felt empowered, and she was actually going to refuge and actually recognising that this isn't right. And similarly, you know, if you empower a male victim, then they realise that domestic violence is wrong, no matter, you know, who the perpetrator is, which gender the perpetrator, which sex which sex the perpetrator is. And I think we need to target it at source. Oh, I've talked about that. You know, the last thing I want to talk about is that one size doesn't fit all. There are what I call slapstick families where, you know, the relationships are just more physical. It's quite strange, but it's true. Some people like to push each other in joking ways or play fight with their partners. And, you know, I don't think it's fair that people in these relationships suddenly come back out and say, oh, actually, you know, he slapped me, you know. And you ask, the devil's in the details, like all lawyer will tell you. So I had a case where this woman said he had been hitting me with a pair of jeans, and I thought, oh, wow, was it, you know, did you see a doctor afterwards? Was it whereabouts did he hit you? And she said, just on my arm. And I was like, oh, okay, left or right? And she said, I don't know, I can't remember. And so, you know, you kind of go, okay, look, did it hurt? You know, she said, no, it didn't, but he hit me, and that was domestic violence. And, you know, you kind of like, well, okay, you kind of think, are you just wasting my time here? You know, I've got 10 other people to see. One of them might be hanging on, you know, might be dying in the next 10 minutes. Or, you know, you actually really hear about a domestic violence issue. You know, I asked which part of the jean did he hit you with? Was it the one with the buckle? Because that could potentially cause injury. And she said, no, it's just the trousers side, you know. And so it's kind of like, well, I feel for you, but it's not really a domestic violence. You know, if there is such, if that's considered domestic violence, then almost all touching is counted as domestic violence. So, and I think with the cultural aspect as well, I've had immigrant, generally women, probably your typical male order brides, I don't know, come in and say, you know, he's the only person that I know in this whole country. I don't want to leave him, you know. I don't care what he does to me, but I don't want to leave him, you know. And we're a family. They're quite particular. They have a particular cultural view that they'd rather be dead than divorce, you know. And it's hard, you know. I think it's right that they might need educating and that to have different options, but in this kind of quick fire environment like a court, it's just not a right place to force them to leave their partners, because where will they go? They'll go to a women's refuge, but that free accommodation will last for 3 months. What are they going to do after 3 months? You know, especially when they have children, where are they going to go? So yeah, I definitely don't think that one size fits all. Do you guys have any questions? I feel like I've talked too much. Yeah?
Okay. Hi. I found it really interesting that when you said the male victims of the unusual cases, do you think a lot of them don't report it as a pride? It's like...
Yes, definitely. Yeah. So, like I said, they find it humorous. You know, they find physical violence more humorous more often. So, yeah, it's really sad.
Just in regards to the woman who was being hit with the jeans or something, surely she's coming to a court with an intimidating encounter, whether or not it was physically injurious or not. She's wanting some sort of action taken against her partner. There's probably some sort of issues going on there and she's intimidated or something.
Yeah. So, again, the devil is in the details. Yeah. So, you know, there are horrendous cases where I had this one guy who, you know, I had to defend him, and all he wanted to talk about was, you know, anal sex, that he pretty much raped a woman. You know, usually it doesn't get as graphic as that, as what the woman said on those orders. Yeah. But with this particular woman, she didn't give a lot of details. She just kind of fluffed around about, you know, oh yeah, there was domestic violence, and I think the facts are more persuasive than saying that there's domestic violence, because, you know, domestic violence could be all sorts of things. What you consider as domestic violence, because he shouted at you, or because you guys were play fighting, and, you know, he threw cushions at you. might not be considered domestic violence, even though in technical definition it is. So the devil is definitely in the details. Yeah. Yes.
I'm just wondering to what degree the unusual cases were...
The unusual?
Especially the serious cases where people didn't go for help before it escalated to that stage. To what degree do you think the parties involved felt disenfranchised from the society in general and the support structures available? Feeling they're not feeling the lack of being part of it, so there's trust or know about.
Definitely. That's a very interesting question because there are many sad cases where we just had to turn the person away because the respondent worker wasn't working that day, or they didn't have the funding to have a respondent worker. And these people just miss out on important, I think, life skills really, anger management courses that they could have done, or some sort of social support if they were homeless. Where could they go? I had one client who was just drunk off his face. You could hardly talk, and he was obviously very violent, but he couldn't remember a thing because he was just totally drunk off his face. And people like that definitely need some social support, and
just a supplementary question to that, you say that people were turned away due to the lack of staffing or resources. How much follow-up is in place for people who are turned away?
Zero.
Really?
Yeah. So you either get it or you don't. It depends on your luck on the day at the court.
That's terrifying.
Once again, I have to cut it short. Thank you. If anyone wants to talk to you afterwards, I'm sure you're willing. We need to get this set up. USB here. Okay, thank you, Judy. Our next speaker is Hana Aoake. I hope I pronounced that correctly. If I haven't, screw it. She has a BA in art history and intends to begin a BFA next year. She's a performance artist and writer, the creator and editor of Dreamy Modern Life. And she has written for Mara magazine, Critic magazine, and she has contributed to several art projects. Today she's discussing a series of 4 specific artistic performances in which the artists use their bodies to disrupt hegemonies. I was going to say that there was a trigger warning about there being nude images and disturbing content, but I think we've kind of established that already, so yay! Here she is.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to Tessa and the Campus Feminist Collective for letting us have this talk. So my discussion, I'm going to give a discussion on the correlation between feminism and performance art. So sort of to begin with, I'll discuss how performance art is, what performance art is as a medium, and how through the use of bodies, artists can challenge hegemonies, and by questioning the various cultural and social apparatuses that frame their bodies to begin with. I'll discuss 4 performances. 2 of these works will be seminal performance works, and then 2 will be from 2 young female artists based in New Zealand, one of which is here. So to begin with, I'll pose the question, how does one succinctly categorise, differentiate and highlight performance as opposed to other types of performance like theatre, busking or television? So a performance can take place anywhere and can be as simple as a list of actions. New York-based seminal performance artist, or the grandmother of performance art, Marina Abramovich, probably has the best analogy that I can give you, which is that an actor would use a toy gun on stage, but a performance artist would use a real loaded gun. So performance art operates using 3 main strategies. So that's memory, chance, and spectacle, or the spectacle. Performance art is a time-based medium, and exists, and although documentation from its initial inception can be, you can see it, it only really exists in the time period in which it's performed or in the memory of the people that have seen it, so the audience. So many artists exercise the practice of the art of failure or chance, and this is what attracts a lot of artists to using performances, because it's so immediate and it is like anything can really happen. And I guess the spectacle of a performance is the energy or the absurdity of the performance or the performative act. So before I start talking about this work, this is kind of, there's this really great quote by this theorist called Elizabeth Ball, where she talks about, she's written a lot about performance and failure in performance art. But power happens to this body, but this body is also the occasion in which something unpredictable and hence undialectical happens to power. It is one site of redirection, profusion, and transvaluation. So this is a work by Audrey Baldwin, who's a Christchurch-based artist. She's originally from Zimbabwe. The title of this work is called Greasy Box. She gained a BFA in sculpture in 2009, and she stated that she uses the body as a site and a method to explore ideas about dominant power structures, value, and self. So Greasy Box was performed at Bizdojo Space last year as part of a show called We Are Alright, which involved, I think, 7 or 8 other artists. So the action was created after she heard the sexist joke. How are KFC and women the same? Once you're done with the breasts and the thighs, you're left with a greasy box to put your bone in. So Baldwin sat in the middle of the space, and she was eating like semi-nude like this. But what was really interesting was that a lot of people that went to the show felt very uncomfortable and didn't want to engage with her, and she stared at them. She stared down those people and kept eating. She ate a whole chicken. It was a large chicken. It was disgusting, but it was a really interesting performance. And I think that it kind of almost refers to, if any of you know Sarah Lucas, she has this photograph called Chicken Knickers with a chicken on her knickers. So basically Baldwin has said that she uses the chicken as a metaphor for describing how women are viewed in society in terms of their appearance and their sexual desirability and availability. I think there's a big correlation between women and the sexual politics of meat. Sorry, that's the Sarah Lucas work there. Okay. So the next work I'm going to talk about is called External Constriction. It's by a woman named Kelly McDowell, who's from Auckland, or lives in Auckland, sorry. So Kelly McDowell is a third-year BVation from Aoate, and she works primarily in performance. She's interested in performance as a medium because of its immediacy and the notion of chance and the empathy that can really register inside the member of the audience's mind. So at a recent performance evening at the Prawn Project, which was a big show that involved, I think, about 50 artists, it was based in Auckland, she performed External Constriction. So it was a performance where McDowell's entire body, as you can see, other than her neck and her head, were covered in tape, and she walked backwards and forwards throughout the space. The constriction of her body meant that her skin looked rubbed raw, almost as though she was bleeding. It was horrible to watch. With each movement, the pain of the action was really made quite clearly, because each limb was so tightly constricted that each movement just looked agonizingly painful. So the performance began without any theatrical connotations, and it immediately challenged the way that we typically consume performance. For example, there was already a pre-assigned point at which I was going to stand up and talk, and you were seated. So it just began. So it's similar to the way in which Audrey Baldwin's work, Greasy Box, kind of challenges these binaries between the audience and the performer, in that it was just there. The spectator, I guess, recognises McDowell's female body as an object of male sexual desire because it is framed within these apparatuses. But I think the performance refers to these hegemonies, but also challenges them by the mere fact that her actions are so abject and just will immediately engage with the audience in a sense of empathy. So after a very long time, the audience was asked to remove the tape. Oop. And at this moment of emancipation, that empathy and tenderness sort of just radiated throughout the room. It was really, yeah. This is probably the most powerful performance that I've ever sort of come across. It's by a Cuban artist called Hana, and it's called Rape Scene from 1973. So she was a Cuban performance artist and sculptor and painter. She was married to Carl Andre, who's a minimalist sculptor, if any of you are interested. She died in 1985. So this was part of a series of works that she devised in response to the rape and murder of a fellow student on the Iowa University campus where she was studying and where she completed her BA, her MA in painting, and her MFA in, I think it was, intermediate. So she invited friends and fellow students to her apartment. The viewer entered through a slightly ajar door in a dark apartment into a room where the artist appeared with a single source of light revealing mid-ears stripped from the waist down. The artist stood slouched and bound over a table, nude from the waist down, and smeared with blood covering her body. Around her was an assemblage of broken plates and blood on the floor. Her direct identification with the specific victim, meant that she could not be seen as an anonymous object in a theatrical tableau. Her identification also registers the patriarchal enterprises which rendered a female body as a site of violence and vulnerability. So this is a work by an Israeli artist called Sigalet Landau. It's called Barbed Hula, and it's the most horrible video I've ever watched, but I think a lot of performance art operates between this attraction and repulsion kind of dichotomy, which is interesting. So she's an Israeli artist who works in sculpture and video and installation art. She was born in Jerusalem. This is, as I was saying, the most visceral video that I've ever seen. It's a shame I don't have probably. So the video just involves Landau's naked body hula hooping barbed wire by a beach. The wire swirls around her hips and simultaneously slashes her stomach. The wires are, it's important to note, they're pointed out, but they still scratch along the surface of her body. So the work is entrenched in both the fact the site of the work is performed in Tel Aviv, so that's the only border in Israel which is neutral. But I guess the main association that I have when I watch it is the religious iconography. Like I think of Christ getting the barbed wire on his head. Barbed wire, sorry, the crown of thorns. But it's a very visceral and powerful performance. So I guess this is just kind of a statement of what she was trying to, what the point of her performance was. The act of desensitization, spinning a hula hoop of barbed wire. I performed at sunrise on a southern beach at Tel Aviv, where fishermen and old people come to start their day and exercise. The beach is the only calm and natural border Israel has. Danger is generated from history into life and into the body. In this video loop, I am performing a hula belly dance. This is a personal and senso-political act conserved with invisible sub-skin borders, surrounding the body actively and endlessly. All of my work relates, in one way or another, to a loss of orientation. The pain here is escaped by the speed of the act, and the fact that the spikes of the barbed wire are mostly turned outwards. If there's any questions?
Okay, so this is the last one, and I'll try and make it quick, but I never do, so don't listen to me. Okay, so this is what I feel is going to be quite a personal talk, and it's about very much my personal experiences, and I wanted to talk about women in the Skeptics community. I feel like kind of have the tie-in at the end. I guess if I was going to call this speech any title, it would be something like Women in the Skeptic Movement, Why There Are So Few, Why the Few of Us Are Leaving, and What Needs to Change, which is a really cumbersome title, so I apologise for that. I think I should preface this by saying that I've been quite conflicted about giving this talk. I am concerned about offending some of the people in the audience and even the very people who sort of are here helping me host this event, but I feel that there's something bigger at stake, that for the sake of the women in the Skeptics movement, it is important to be critical of institutions, ideologies, and ourselves, even at the expense of hurt feelings. So with that ominous beginning, I guess I'll just launch into it. As for my credentials, I gained my Master's in Film, Television and Media Studies in 2012 at Auckland Uni, and looking specifically at feminist film theory. I ended up switching over to the philosophy department, and I intend to pursue a PhD in feminist continental philosophy, though somewhere else, because Auckland Uni philosophy has only a few courses for continental philosophy and absolutely none in the way of feminist philosophy. In fact, much like the sciences and in the Skeptics movement, philosophy is renowned for having a pretty piss-poor representation of women in its field. We have the largest philosophy department in New Zealand and a grand total of 4 female lecturers, and dropping, plus only 1 female PhD student. I have had some first-hand experience of some of the antiquated attitudes present in philosophy. I once raised concerns at a meeting about the lack of feminist philosophy papers, only to be told by a staff member that it wasn't philosophy's problem and that I should go to the Women's Studies department. By the way, is there anyone here from the Women's Studies department? Yeah, that's because there isn't one.
It shows my age, but there was when I was around.
Yeah, not anymore.
But to your credit, even at that point, it wasn't really a department. It was kind of like a take courses from multiple departments.
So no more department, but thanks. So, great. I came out of that meeting with this simple conclusion about the lecturer who had dismissed me, namely that, he was a dick. But I have to say that his dickishness is very much in the minority. The philosophy department has been by and large wonderfully supportive of its concerns being raised by female students. This year a Women in Philosophy group was set up by its single female PhD student, Talia Sellers, of which I am the co-administrator, and I also ran a Women in Philosophy reading group for the majority of the year. The department also paid for me to go to the Australian National University in Canberra to attend a workshop about women in philosophy and what needs to change. And some of the advice I got from that will also be used here. Start with, I am a lucky feminist. From early childhood, I grew up in an environment of strong women who taught me never to defer to anyone's opinion based on gender. My introduction to the Skeptics movement came later in life, but was given to me by one of those same strong women and an older brother who grew up in the same environment and also considers himself to be a passionate feminist. It is surprising then that it took a while for me to realise that I deviated from the demographic of the average skeptic. I am a woman, which is uncommon in the movement. I'm a lesbian, which is even rarer. If I were black, I would be a fucking unicorn. And if you'd asked me a year ago if I were a skeptic, I would have emphatically told you yes, that I believed in the scientific method and secularist ideals, that vaccines don't cause autism, that psychics are at best delusional and at worst cynical charlatans, and that homeopathy is fucking water. I still believe these things, but I don't know that I'm a skeptic anymore. Some days, I think I know that I'm not. This has been an intensely personal discovery, made all the more intense by the fact that I realised that it is becoming a fairly universal experience for a lot of women who once called themselves skeptics. My disillusionment has been slow in coming. It began with some alarming international incidents of skeptics involved in some very sexist behaviour. Yes, I'm going to talk about Rebecca Watson, Mr. Atheist himself, Richard Dawkins, and the elevator incident. To anyone in the audience who wants to roll their eyes at me and say that it was ages ago or it's already been talked about a million times before, I'm going to borrow a line from Bill Hicks and say, then don't talk to me about Jesus. To anyone who doesn't know what I'm talking about, here is the rundown. Rebecca Watson is a renowned blogger and podcast host who goes by the alias of the Skeptic. After attending numerous conferences where she was frequently the only woman attendee and often the subject of unwanted and unwarranted sexual advances in an environment where she was clearly outnumbered, she became one of the movement's most outspoken feminist critics. Watson's stories can be quite harrowing. While being a prominent skeptic atheist means you are no stranger to death threats, hers often veer on the side of rape and torture as well. In 2001, she was part of the World Atheist Convention with the evolutionary biologist and atheist megastar Richard Dawkins. She was also on a panel where she discussed some of the more negative experiences as a woman in the movement. She later vlogged about her experience at the conference, making mention of an incident after the talk and after drinks with some attendees, in which one of the men attending followed her to the elevator alone and, prefacing his speech with, "Don't take this the wrong way," told her that he found her interesting and invited her back to his room for coffee. Given that she was alone in the elevator, alone in a foreign country, that it was 4 in the morning and that she had just spent the day talking about how men need to not put women in these kinds of uncomfortable or frankly scary situations, Watson chose to point out in this blog that the man had missed the point, acted inappropriately, and simply asked, "Guys, don't do that." This 2-minute section of her 8-minute video caused a minor furore. As of my last checking on YouTube, it has 1,812 likes against a staggering 11,486 dislikes, with comments such as, "Feminism is for people who think they're victims, not people who are actually victims." And it's a mystery how this bitch, it's a mystery how to ask this bitch out without being called a rapist. I think what the guy should have done was walk up to her, slap her, and say sorry for being a man. But to be fair, we all know that by and large YouTube commentators are, in fact, the lowest form of life on this planet. What was more interesting was the response by Richard Dawkins himself, which came in the form of an open letter that goes as follows. "Dear Muslima," referencing to the Muslim women of the world, "stop whining, will you? Yes, yes. I know you had your genitals mutilated with a razor blade, and yawn, don't tell me again. I know you aren't allowed to drive a car, and you can't leave your house without a male relative, and your husband is allowed to beat you, and you'll be stoned to death if you commit adultery. But stop whining, will you? Think of the suffering your poor American sisters have to put up with. Only this week I heard of one. She calls herself Skeptic. And do you know what happened to her? A man in a hotel elevator invited her back to his room for coffee. I'm not exaggerating. He really did. He invited her back to his room for coffee. Of course she said no, and of course he didn't lay a finger on her, but even so. And you, Muslima, think you have misogyny to complain about. For goodness sake, grow up, or at least grow a thicker skin. Richard. Or as I would have signed him off, Dick. That this was the response of a world-renowned intellectual is flabbergasting. What continues to bother me, however, is that the conversations that continue to happen. Some have said that they thought that Watson unfairly scapegoated a man who had really done nothing wrong. All she needed to do was say no and leave, which was likely what she did. The extent to which that argument misses the point blows my mind. Even if this man, who by the way Watson is kept unnamed, was merely missing the point, it doesn't justify the outpouring of rage that came against Watson. Nor does it justify one of the poster boys of the Skeptics movement disseminating a letter that belittled her experiences of objectification, having himself never experienced such kinds of sexism. Luckily, the Resident Science Society of Auckland Uni has been pretty good at dismissing Dawkins, not just for the elevator incident, and not just for the Adelaide incident. While Dawkins may have been an exemplary evolutionary biologist, he is a shitty philosopher of atheism. I know a bunch of metaphysicians in the philosophy department who can attest to that. But there are other icons of the skeptics and atheist movements whose rampant sexism have stayed under the radar. Take, for example, the late Christopher Hitchens, skeptic and political journalist, whose charisma and biting wit made him one of the most admired public figures of the last 20 years before his death. People may remember his excoriating critique of people such as Henry Kissinger and Mother Teresa, his support of the Iraq War, but also his excellent denouncement of waterboarding as torture. And he was a big old atheist. What people don't remember are things like his 2007 Vanity Fair article entitled, "Why Women Aren't Funny." When, April of 2008, Tina Fey, Amy Poehler, Maya Rudolph, Kristen Wiig and Sarah Silverman joined forces to publish their own article, Who Says Women Aren't Funny? Hitchens would not let it slide and instead produced a YouTube video entitled, Why Women Still Aren't Funny. His argument was effectively that women were not required to be funny, more likely they were required to be beautiful and childbearing, and that evidence of this can be seen throughout history in the simple lack of output in humorous female literature and arts. Let's put aside the fact that historically women have been forbidden access to artistic and comedic spheres that would allow them to publish their own comedy, and that in spite of this, countless women throughout history have been renowned as wits. Even if we do buy his argument that socially women have been conditioned not to be funny, that through no fault of their own society has limited their ability to be comedians, calling the article Why Women Aren't Funny is fairly flawed. It would be like writing an article that attributed the lack of African American intellectuals to the historical restriction of quality education and then calling it Why Black People Aren't Smart. And with this kind of misogynist bullshit making its way through some of the most revered members of the skeptics community, I can't help but wonder how it permeates into smaller spaces, into Facebook groups and forums, the very spaces where women who are interested in skeptic theory might seek to dip their toes into. Even the skeptic spaces that are run by people who are sympathetic to women's issues can be very unsafe to women. Here I feel as though I have to be very honest and critical of the RSS at Auckland Uni, which, considering they are some excellent people who have facilitated this event, organised the room, and are sitting here politely listening to me, makes me feel like a bit of a cunt. Which, as a feminist dyke, is a word I feel I have a right to claim back. If you have any problems with that, you can see me after the talk. When I encounter a nonsensical argument for women sticking within their feminist roles in society from a religious foundation, I often roll my eyes and then let it roll off my back. I can dismiss it as simple ignorance. When it comes from the skeptics community, however, it is often under the guise of science, the biological destiny that can be confirmed by hormone levels and neurological studies. We become trapped in our own enlightenment ideals. We take scientific methodology as dogma, not critiquing the very ideals behind that dogma, whether the overwhelming stranglehold that gender has on our society might bias us, might bias the method from the get-go. The bad science has been known to come up on the RSS page. I remember one incident where a commentator once tried to make an argument that it was a man's biological impulse to catcall a woman on the street, a natural response to a woman's, and I'm quoting him, merchandise. By and large, the men of RSS were champions of women's causes, and many members of the board called this idiot out. However, when it came down to whether he should be penalised for this kind of sexist rhetoric, I was told by a member, not a member in this room, I should point out, that while the RSS didn't condone his actions, they had rules about free speech that permitted him to make such claims even though they were hugely controversial. This was not like my Campus Feminist Collective. RSS, and I was told, did not operate as a safe space. This I found to be absurd. A safe space is not a campfire circle where we sit around writing in our feelings journal and brush each other's hair. A safe space allows for disagreement, for difference, for passionate discussion. It just does so with the understanding that the participants in that discussion recognise the other people there, that they have feelings, they are worth something. But I backed down from that argument, accepted the terms presented to me, and I now believe failed not simply to be an ethical feminist, but to be an ethical person. I should have fought against it. I should have explained that speech is not noise. I should have explained that speech is not noise. Speech isn't passive, that one action of speech can silence another. I should have fought for the fact that every woman reading that statement would recall every living embodied experience where men had shouted lewd names at them on the street, how their merchandise had been groped by strangers in public places. For the man who posted it, and for the men who argued against him, as much as I appreciate and admire their efforts, their arguments were still about the hypothetical. This is not hypothetical for women. This is our lived experience. When we talk about the importance of something like vaccinations on the board, we do so with rationality, but also with incredible emotion. We know that deaths and harm, and we know that the deaths and harms that come from not vaccinating are horrible. We think of the innocent lives lost and how it could affect us. We embody this experience. When a post about abortion comes up and 80 guys comment on it and not one woman does, we turn the issue into something of abstraction when there are real women out there who embody this experience. Finally, in terms of things that are problematic for these types of boards, another thing that's problematic for these types of boards are what metaphysical philosopher Helen Beebe has described the aggressive argumentative style, a major problem within both philosophy and the Reason and Science Society. We've all probably been at the end of a talk where someone has asked a question and the speaker has answered it either not entirely well or not to the satisfaction of the original questioner. Luckily that hasn't happened yet. The questioner then proceeds to badger the talker incessantly with the same point over and over and over again. The talk ceases to be informative. Instead it becomes two heads butting together, hoping one will win. Nobody ever does. This aggressive style of banter is frighteningly common on almost all skeptic sites I have seen, and it is off-putting to women. Not because women can't handle it, but because when you're already on the margins of a group, being aggressively and often unnecessarily badgered, or even just seeing it happen to someone makes you feel more alienated and less likely to participate. Still, I have been told that this is simply the style of the debate, one that we just have to accept. Given that the purpose of this talk is to offer, one of the purposes of this talk is to offer tips for how to make women feel more at home in skeptic spaces, I'm going to start right now by calling bullshit on that particular example. We do not have to accept that style of discussion. We do not have to kowtow to the prevailing belief that we foster the egos of a bunch of people engaged in nothing more than an ideological pissing contest. We can be examples of rigorous critical analysis and also be civil to each other. We can know what the battles are that need to be fought and when to let things slide. This, alongside the abstraction of women's issues, calls for a re-evaluation of how we conduct these forums, moderations that guard against sexism, that promote truly free speech and eliminate the speech that silences. We need to moderate for the marginalised minority members, knowing that they don't come to these spaces on an even footing. Other spaces also need to be made available for women to feel safe and to share their own experiences as members of RSS and as skeptics. Kylie Hudson, a member of the exec, set up a Women in RSS group, which I've participated in as well. However, time poverty and just the sheer lack of women there actually are to participate means it has been a difficult enterprise to keep up, though I hope we continue to try to do so. The dialogue between the RSS and the CSS has also been good, and hopefully it can continue to prosper. As for my own participation in the Skeptics movement, I still don't know. I am a feminist first and foremost, and will always be. Skepticism will always be lower down on the list. If the movement continues the way that it's going, then I'm gone. There's no question about that. In my ideal world, we might splinter, create our own new space of feminist skeptics who overwhelm the anti-feminists with our intelligence and our humanity. Because this was once my community too, and a part of me still wants it to be my community. Thank you.